Imagine waking to a sky that shimmers with light that never was, where bands of ice and stone circle overhead like a crown of silver dreams. The morning air carries the same coolness you have always known, but something profound has changed in the way shadows fall across the garden where Sarah tends her roses in the small village of Millbrook, and the way fishermen like old Thomas cast their nets into waters that now reflect not just clouds and birds, but the gentle arc of countless particles dancing in the heavens above. If you are finding peace in these words tonight, perhaps you might like this gentle journey we are taking together, and if so, a simple like would mean the world, and maybe you could share in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you feel moved to support more of these quiet explorations, a channel membership would help create more films like this one. But for now, let us simply drift together into this world where Earth wears rings, like Saturn, where the familiar has become magical. The silence here feels different somehow, deeper and more layered, as if the very presence of these celestial bands has taught the world a new way to breathe. And when Sarah looks up from her morning work in the garden, she sees something that perhaps no human eyes have ever truly witnessed: the way sunlight catches and scatters through billions of fragments of ice and rock, creating patterns of light that shift and dance across the sky like aurora that never fades. The rings themselves seem to whisper stories of how they came to be, whether they formed from some ancient moon that wandered too close to Earth and was gently pulled apart by gravity's patient hands, or perhaps they gathered slowly over millions of years, cosmic dust and debris finding their way into perfect circular motion around our world, each particle settling into its destined orbit as if following some grand celestial choreography that began long before the first human ever looked up and wondered. Thomas remembers his grandfather speaking of the old days, though those memories feel strange now, like dreams of a time when the sky was simpler, when night brought only stars and the occasional comet, when fishermen navigated by constellations alone and never had to account for the way ring shadows move across the water as Earth turns, creating patterns of light and dark that change throughout the day like a vast sundial written across the surface of the sea. Could it be that these rings have always been meant to be here, that our world was somehow incomplete without them, and we simply lived for thousands of years not knowing what we were missing, the way a person might live their whole life without hearing a particular piece of music and then, upon finally hearing it, realize that some part of their soul had been waiting for exactly those notes, exactly that melody all along. The morning light filters through the ring plane differently than sunlight ever did before, softer somehow, more forgiving, as if each particle of ice acts as a tiny lens, bending and shaping the light into something that feels almost like a blessing falling gently on the world below. In the physics of it all lies something beautiful and strange, the way these countless fragments maintain their perfect dance around Earth, each one following the laws that govern all things in motion, yet together creating something that appears almost alive, almost conscious in its grace. Sarah pauses in her gardening and watches a flock of birds navigate the new sky, and she wonders if they too feel the difference, if their ancient instincts for migration have had to adjust to this transformed world where the very architecture of heaven has changed, where magnetic fields and gravitational forces create subtle influences that perhaps only creatures who live by sensing such things would notice. The temperature of morning air may be slightly different now, cooled perhaps by the shadows that the rings cast as they pass between Earth and the sun, creating a rhythm of warmth and coolness that follows patterns no one has yet fully understood, like a vast breathing of light and shadow that marks time in new ways. Thomas pulls in his nets and finds them full, and he cannot say if the fish are drawn by the new patterns of light that dance beneath the water, or if it is simply that this transformed world has made him more attentive to the rhythms that were always there, waiting to be noticed by eyes that had learned to see differently. The sound of water lapping against the small dock carries further in this new world, as if the presence of the rings has somehow changed the way sound travels, though perhaps that is merely the imagination of an old fisherman who has learned to find meaning in the smallest changes, the way wise people do when they have spent long years listening to the world speak in whispers. Children in Millbrook run through streets that are painted with moving shadows, shadows that shift throughout the day as the ring system rotates above, creating a natural playground of light and dark that changes by the hour, and their laughter seems to echo differently under this transformed sky, more musical somehow, as if joy itself has been enhanced by beauty. What mysteries might these rings hold in their silent orbits? What stories of cosmic forces and ancient events that played out long before human civilizations ever developed telescopes powerful enough to see such wonders around distant worlds? The very air seems to hold more possibility now, charged with the presence of this celestial architecture that surrounds the world like a vast cathedral made of ice and stone. Each particle a tiny prayer while spinning in eternal motion. Each orbit a meditation on the forces that hold all things together in their proper places. Evening approaches earlier now in some places, later in others, depending on where one stands relative to the ring shadows, creating a new geography of time that maps itself across the world in bands of earlier and later sunsets, earlier and later dawns. A complex rhythm that perhaps only astronomers and poets will fully appreciate. Sarah walks through her village as the first stars appear, and she sees neighbors gathered in small groups, pointing upward and speaking quietly about the way the rings catch and hold starlight, creating a crown of gentle radiance that makes the whole sky seem more intimate, more protective, like a vast tent of light stretched over the world to keep all safe within. The questions that arise in such moments feel important somehow, profound in the way that simple questions often are. How long will these rings endure? Will they fade gradually over millions of years or persist until the sun itself grows old and changes? And what will future generations make of this gift that has been given to the sky? This beauty that has transformed the very meaning of looking upward. Thomas secures his boat and walks home along paths now lit by a different quality of starlight, light that has been touched and changed by its passage through the ring system. And he thinks of all the sailors who have ever navigated by stars and wonders what they would make of this new sky. This transformed heaven that requires new maps and new methods of finding one's way. The night sounds begin as they always have, but they seem to harmonize now with something larger, some vast and gentle presence that circles overhead, and those who listen carefully might hear in the wind a new note, a deeper resonance that comes from living beneath this crown of ice and stone that has transformed the very meaning of home. In the spaces between heartbeats, between breaths, between the words we speak to one another in the gathering darkness, there lives now the awareness that Earth has become something new, something more beautiful than it was, something that asks us to look upward with fresh eyes and remember what it means to live beneath wonders that dwarf our understanding yet somehow make us feel more human, more connected to the vast dance of matter and energy that carries all worlds through space in patterns. Too large and too beautiful for any single mind to fully grasp. The autumn air carries with it the scent of leaves beginning their slow surrender to winter, and in this transformed world where rings of ice and stone circle overhead, even the changing seasons seem to whisper of deeper mysteries, of the way time moves in circles within circles, the way all things that rise must eventually fall and rise again in endless patterns that mirror the very dance of particles spinning in their celestial orbits above. Sarah kneels beside her garden bed, her fingers working through soil that has been touched by shadows unlike any that have fallen on Earth before. Shadows that move in great arcs across the landscape as the ring system rotates with a precision that speaks to forces older than continents, older than the first stirrings of life in ancient seas. The quality of light filtering through the ring plane has grown softer as autumn deepens, each particle of ice acting as a lens that bends and shapes the sunlight into something that feels almost like music made visible. Patterns of brightness and shade that shift across the village of Millbrook with a rhythm that no clock could measure, a tempo set by the laws that govern all bodies in motion around other bodies in the vast symphony of gravitational forces that hold the universe together. Thomas sits by his kitchen window, a worn notebook open before him as he records the times of ring shadow and the changing patterns of light on the water. Observations that perhaps no human has ever needed to make before. Notes written in careful handwriting that documents the birth of a new kind of time, a new way of measuring the hours by the passage of celestial architecture across the face of the sun. The texture of bark on the old oak trees seems different somehow in this transformed light, more intricate, as if the gentle radiance filtering down through the rings reveals details that harsh direct sunlight might have hidden. The way candlelight can make familiar rooms feel mysterious and new. Scientists in distant cities may be working to understand the mechanics of how such rings could have formed around Earth, whether through the gradual capture of asteroid debris over millions of years or perhaps through some more dramatic event. The breakup of a small moon that wandered too close to our world and was gently pulled apart by tidal forces, its remains settling into the elegant circular dance that now graces the sky like a crown of ancient ice. The stones along the riverbank where Thomas walks in the early evening seem to hold memories of deep time, of the eons that passed before humans ever looked up and wondered about the lights that moved against the fixed stars. And now these same stones reflect a new kind of starlight, light that has been touched and transformed by its passage through countless fragments of cosmic debris that circle the world in rings so vast that their full circumference could wrap around Earth more than 3 times. Sarah tends to her roses with hands that have learned to work by the changing patterns of ring light, noting how the flowers seem to respond differently to this softer radiance. Their petals perhaps opening more slowly, closing more gently, as if they too have learned to move in harmony with the great celestial clockwork that now governs the rhythm of day and night. The wind carries sounds further in this new world, voices and bird songs and the gentle lapping of water against stone, as if the presence of the rings has somehow changed the very nature of how vibrations move through air, though perhaps that is simply the imagination of those who have become more attentive to the subtleties of their environment, more aware of the delicate relationships between all things. In the growing dusk, the rings begin to catch and hold the last light of day, creating a phenomenon that astronomers might call forward scattering, where countless particles of ice and rock become tiny mirrors reflecting and redirecting sunlight in patterns that paint the sky with bands of gentle luminescence. A natural light show that could continue for hours after the sun has set, filling the darkness with a soft glow that makes navigation possible even on the darkest nights. Thomas records these observations in his notebook, sketching the way the ring shadows fall across the water at different times of day, documenting patterns that future generations might use to understand how this transformed world moves through space, how the angle of the rings relative to the sun changes with the seasons, creating variations in light and shadow that follow cycles within cycles, time nested inside time like the rings of a tree or the chambers of a shell. The surface of the river reflects not just the usual sky but something more complex, a tapestry of light woven from starshine and ring glow and the occasional meteor that burns up in the upper atmosphere, creating brief streaks of brilliance that seem almost like messages written in fire across the dome of heaven. Children in Millbrook have begun to learn new games that involve predicting when the ring shadows will pass over certain landmarks, when the bands of light will align with the church spire or the old mill wheel, developing an intuitive understanding of celestial mechanics that comes naturally to those who grow up under such wonders. The way children who live by the ocean learn to read the moods of tides and weather without ever studying oceanography or meteorology. The walls of houses and the surfaces of garden paths hold textures that have been revealed by this new quality of light, patterns in stone and wood that direct sunlight might have washed out, details that emerge only under the gentle radiance that filters down through the ring system like light falling through the most delicate of stained glass windows. Sarah pauses in her evening walk and notices how the bark of the old elm tree beside the village green seems almost aglow with its own inner light, each groove and ridge picked out in subtle detail by the ring glow that has replaced the harsh certainty of electric street lamps with something softer, more mysterious, more in keeping with the rhythms that governed human settlements for thousands of years before the invention of artificial light. The question of how long these rings might endure becomes more than academic as the seasons change. As people begin to build their lives around the new patterns of light and shadow, the new ways of telling time and finding direction, and perhaps somewhere deep in the ice and stone that circles overhead lie clues to their own longevity, hints written in the very composition of the particles about whether they were born yesterday in cosmic terms or have been waiting for billions of years to find their way into orbit around a world that could appreciate their beauty. Thomas closes his notebook as full darkness settles over Millbrook, but darkness now means something different than it did before, because even when the sun has set completely, the rings continue to catch and scatter starlight, creating a faint luminous arch that spans from horizon to horizon like a bridge made of captured moonbeams. The stones beneath his feet as he walks home seem older somehow, more connected to the deep processes that shape worlds and move continents and bring ice from the outer reaches of the solar system to dance in perfect circles around planets that have learned to wear such ornaments like jewelry crafted by time itself. Sarah draws her curtains but leaves a small gap through which she can see the gentle glow of the rings, and she wonders if future generations will take such wonders for granted the way people once grew accustomed to sunsets and rainbows, or if there is something about the presence of rings around Earth that will always inspire a sense of mystery, always remind those who look up that they live on a world that has been transformed by forces larger than human understanding. The texture of sleep itself may be different under such skies, dreams perhaps colored by the awareness that even in the deepest night, great wheels of ice and stone continue their silent dance overhead, marking time in ways that connect the sleeper to rhythms that stretch back to the formation of the solar system and forward to futures that may see these same rings endure long after the last human voice has fallen silent. The air grows cooler as midnight approaches, carrying with it the promise of frost that will silver the grass by morning, and somewhere in that cooling air moves a subtle current that speaks of change, of seasons turning within the larger turning of the rings, of time measured not just in minutes and hours, but in the slow procession of cosmic architecture across the star fields that form the backdrop for all earthly concerns. And those who listen carefully to the wind might hear, in its whisper, the first hints that something new is stirring, something that will ask even more of those who have learned to live beneath this crown of ancient ice and stone. The wind that carries such promises of change also brings with it the memory of older seasons, older patterns of light and shadow that lived in the world before the rings came to crown the sky. And in the dusty archives of the small library in Millbrook, tucked between volumes of local history and collections of pressed wildflowers, lie field notes written by a naturalist named Edmund who walked these same paths decades ago, recording observations that now seem like messages from another age, entirely. Sarah discovers these notebooks on an afternoon when the ring shadows move slowly across the library windows, casting patterns that shift like thoughts forming and dissolving in a mind at rest. And as she turns the yellowed pages, she finds sketches of birds that no longer migrate in quite the same patterns, drawings of cloud formations that may have changed their shapes when the gravitational field around Earth grew more complex with the addition of so much orbiting mass. The handwriting speaks of mornings when dew settled differently on the grass, when frost formed patterns that followed rules which perhaps the rings have gently altered, creating subtle changes in the way moisture moves through air that has learned to carry the influence of countless particles spinning overhead in their eternal dance. Thomas finds himself drawn to the old tide charts that hang in the harbormaster's office, documents that map the rise and fall of water according to cycles that may need revision now, because the rings, however light they might seem when scattered across such vast distances, still possess mass enough to create their own small tidal effects, tugging at the oceans with forces too subtle for casual observation but perhaps significant enough to shift the timing of high water by minutes that could accumulate over months into something worth noting. The fading light of late afternoon reveals textures in the old stone walls of the village that seem more pronounced now, as if the gentler radiance filtering through the ring system allows shadows to pool more deeply in the carved initials and weathered joints, making visible the patient work of centuries during which rain and wind wore away at granite and limestone with the same quiet persistence that shapes all things given enough time to complete their slow transformations. In the margins of Edmund's notebooks, Sarah finds small questions penciled in a careful hand, wonderings about whether certain flowers bloomed earlier or later in years when the weather followed patterns that now seem impossible to recreate, seasons that unfolded according to rhythms that the presence of the rings may have gently disrupted, creating new relationships between temperature and sunlight that botanists are perhaps only beginning to understand. The soil in her garden holds samples of what the world was like before these changes, layers of earth that preserve the chemical signatures of rainfall that fell through clear skies, precipitation that carried no trace of the cosmic dust that now settles so lightly, so invisibly, from the ring system onto every surface that faces upward toward the transformed heavens. Thomas spreads old charts across his kitchen table, comparing the penciled notations of fishing grounds and weather patterns with his own recent observations, noting discrepancies that might be explained by the way the rings now cast shadows that move across the surface of the sea, cooling the water in predictable bands that could influence where certain species of fish prefer to feed, creating new invisible boundaries in an ocean that has worn the same basic patterns for millennia. The light that falls through the library windows grows softer as evening approaches, and Sarah realizes that Edmund's notes contain references to aurora displays that appeared on certain dates, celestial phenomena that may now be impossible to observe in quite the same way because the ring system acts as a natural filter, bending and scattering the charged particles from the sun that once painted the polar skies with curtains of green and red and blue radiance. Water moves differently now around the pilings of the old dock, creating small eddies and currents that follow patterns Thomas cannot quite predict, as if the gravitational influence of the rings extends even to the movement of tides and the way waves break against familiar shores. Subtle alterations that speak to the deep interconnectedness of all things that orbit and spin and pull upon each other in the vast clockwork of celestial mechanics. The pressed flowers in Edmund's collection seem to hold colors that are somehow more vivid than their modern counterparts. petals that caught and held sunlight that came to Earth unfiltered, undiffused by passage through the countless fragments of ice and stone that now circle overhead like a crown of cosmic jewelry that transforms the very quality of illumination that reaches the gardens and fields below. Sarah traces her finger along the faded ink of weather observations, noting patterns of storm systems that moved across the region in great spirals, atmospheric disturbances that may now follow slightly different paths as the rings create subtle changes in air pressure and temperature gradients that influence how clouds form and where rain falls, and which way the wind chooses to blow on any given afternoon. The maps that line the walls of the harbormaster's office show coastlines that have remained constant for human memory. But Thomas wonders if the additional tidal forces created by the rings might gradually shift the patterns of erosion and deposition, moving sand and silt in new ways that could, over decades or centuries, alter the very shape of harbors and beaches with changes so slow that only the most careful observers would notice the transformation while it was happening. In the growing dusk, the rings begin their nightly transformation into bands of luminous beauty, catching the last sunlight and holding it like water cupped in careful hands, creating a phenomenon that Edmund could never have witnessed, never could have imagined when he walked these same paths and wrote his careful observations of a world that seemed fixed in its patterns, eternal in its rhythms. The stone steps that lead up to the library have been worn smooth by countless footsteps, each person who climbed them contributing to the slow sculpture that time carves from even the hardest granite. And perhaps the rings too are engaged in their own patient work of transformation, changing the world in ways too subtle and gradual to measure with any instruments except those that can record the accumulated effects of decades or centuries of gentle influence. Sarah closes Edmund's notebook as the library prepares to close for the evening, but she carries with her the sense that these old observations hold keys to understanding how much the world has changed, how many small adjustments in the behavior of weather and wildlife and the movement of water might be attributed to the presence of the cosmic architecture that now defines the sky above Millbrook. The texture of twilight feels different as she walks home, richer somehow, as if the rings have taught the air itself new ways to hold light and shadow, new methods of creating the gradual transitions between day and night that make evening such a contemplative time for those who have learned to read the subtle messages written in the changing colors of the western sky. Thomas secures his boat with ropes that have absorbed the moisture of countless mornings, fibers that have learned the rhythm of tides that may now follow cycles slightly out of phase with the ancient patterns that guided sailors for thousands of years before the rings came to complicate the gravitational dance between Earth and Moon with their own small but persistent influence on the movement of water. The old lighthouse that stands at the mouth of the harbor has guided ships through these waters for more than a century, its beams sweeping across waves that reflected only starlight and moonlight until the rings began their own contribution to the illumination of the night, adding layers of gentle radiance that create new landmarks in the darkness, new reference points for those who make their living from the sea. In the archive boxes stored in the library basement rest samples of rainwater collected by Edmund during his years of observation, glass vials that contain the chemical signature of precipitation that fell through skies innocent of cosmic dust, water that may taste subtly different from the rain that falls today through air that has been touched by particles worn from asteroids and comets in the outer reaches of the solar system. The old weather vane on top of the church spire has pointed the direction of winds for generations, but perhaps those winds now carry trace elements that were never present in the atmosphere before. Microscopic fragments of the ring system that settle like the finest snow onto every surface, gradually altering the composition of soil and water in ways that might only become apparent to scientists who think to look for such subtle changes. Sarah pauses at her garden gate and wonders what other records might exist in the growth rings of trees, in the layers of sediment at the bottom of ponds, in the migration patterns of birds that perhaps followed magnetic fields now slightly altered by the presence of so much orbiting material, tiny changes that could accumulate over time into shifts significant enough to require new maps, new charts, new ways of understanding how the world moves through its cycles of season and storm and the patient turning of days into years, into decades of slow transformation. The morning when Sarah first notices something different about the way frost forms on her garden gate arrives with the kind of stillness that seems to hold secrets. Air so clear and motionless that each breath feels like drawing in the essence of early winter. And as she approaches the metal latch that has opened and closed under her hands for countless seasons, she sees patterns of ice crystal that spiral in ways she cannot quite remember seeing before, delicate formations that seem to follow curves more complex than the simple geometric shapes that Frost usually prefers. The temperature hovers just below freezing, that precise point where water vapor becomes art. And in the silence that surrounds this moment, she can hear something almost musical, a faint tinkling sound that might be the ice crystals themselves settling into their intricate arrangements, or perhaps the distant whisper of particles high above in the ring system as they catch and scatter the first light of dawn across their frozen surfaces. Thomas stands at his kitchen window at almost the same moment, drawn by a quality of light that seems different from any he has witnessed in his decades of watching the sun rise over the harbor. A radiance that appears to move in slow waves across the water, creating bands of brightness and shadow that pulse with a rhythm unlike anything he has recorded in his careful notebooks. The surface of the sea holds a texture that seems almost alive, ripples that catch the ring light and throw it back in patterns that shift and dance like aurora made horizontal. And as he reaches for his notebook to document this phenomenon, he notices that his pencil leaves marks on the paper that seem more vivid somehow, as if even the graphite responds to the subtle changes in electromagnetic fields that may accompany the presence of so much orbiting material circling overhead. The sound in the air carries differently this morning, voices and footsteps and the gentle lapping of water against stone traveling further and with greater clarity, as if the atmosphere itself has become more receptive to vibration, more willing to carry messages across the distances that separate one heart from another in the small village of Millbrook. Sarah touches the frost patterns on her gate and finds them surprisingly warm beneath her fingertip. Not the sharp cold she expects, but something more complex. A sensation that seems to pulse gently like a heartbeat made of ice. And she wonders if the cosmic dust that settles so invisibly from the ring system might carry trace amounts of minerals that alter the way water freezes, creating crystal structures that follow rules slightly different from those that governed frost formation in the world that existed before the rings came to crown the sky. The shadows that fall across Thomas's dock move with a precision that feels almost deliberate, marking time in increments that do not quite match the movement of the sun. And as he kneels to examine the patterns more closely, he discovers that the wooden planks beneath his knees hold a warmth that seems to come from within, as if the timber itself has learned to store and release the subtle energies that flow through materials touched by radiance that has passed through countless fragments of ancient ice and stone. In the growing light, both Sarah and Thomas begin to perceive something that may have been present for months or years without their noticing. A gentle vibration that runs through the ground beneath their feet, through the air they breathe, through the water that flows past the village on its way to the sea. A rhythm so subtle that it exists at the very edge of human perception, like the heartbeat of the world itself made audible to those who have learned to listen with more than their ears. The frost on Sarah's gate begins to melt as the sun climbs higher, but instead of simply disappearing as frost always has before, the ice crystals seem to dissolve into patterns that linger for moments longer than physics should allow, creating temporary mandalas of moisture that catch the light like tiny lenses before finally evaporating into air that carries their memory in the form of humidity that may settle differently, condense in new places, follow cycles that have been gently altered by influences too subtle to measure with ordinary instruments. Thomas notices that the tide is arriving 7 minutes earlier than his charts predict. A small discrepancy that might mean nothing or might represent the first observable evidence that the gravitational influence of the rings has begun to accumulate into effects significant enough to require new calculations, new methods of predicting when the water will rise and fall around the ancient pilings that have supported this dock through decades of storms and seasonal changes. The quality of silence between the sounds of morning seems deeper now, more layered, as if the presence of the ring system has taught the world new ways to hold stillness, new methods of creating spaces where thoughts can settle like silt at the bottom of a clear pool, undisturbed by the currents that once kept everything in constant motion. Sarah walks through her garden and notices that the soil beneath her feet responds differently to her footsteps, not softer or harder than before, but somehow more receptive, as if the earth itself has become more willing to accept the impressions left by those who tend it, more eager to record the passage of seasons in the patient accumulation of organic matter that builds fertility one fallen leaf at a time. The light that filters through the bare branches of the old elm tree beside the village green creates patterns on the ground that shift with a rhythm Sarah cannot quite predict. Shadows that seem to breathe with the same gentle pulse that she felt in the frost crystals on her gate. And as she watches these movements, she begins to sense that the rings may be influencing more than just the quality of illumination that reaches the earth, perhaps affecting the electromagnetic fields that guide the growth of plants, and the navigation of animals in ways that science is only beginning to understand. Thomas records the temperature of the seawater and finds it 3 degrees warmer than his measurements from the same date last year. A change that could be attributed to weather patterns or seasonal variation, but might also reflect the way the rings create subtle alterations in how solar energy reaches the surface of the planet, concentrating heat in some areas while diffusing it in others according to the complex geometry of their orbital dance. The sound of church bells carries across the village with a resonance that seems richer than Thomas remembers, each note hanging in the air longer and with greater complexity. Harmonics that suggest the presence of the ring system may be creating acoustic effects that enhance the way sound waves propagate through an atmosphere that has learned to vibrate in harmony with cosmic forces operating on scales that dwarf human comprehension. Sarah discovers that the water in her rain barrel has developed a slight luminescence, a faint glow that becomes visible only in complete darkness. And she wonders if this phenomenon might be caused by microscopic particles from the ring system that have settled into the collected precipitation, bringing with them trace elements formed in the outer regions of the solar system, where ice and rock have danced together for billions of years before finding their way into orbit around a world that has learned to wear such ornaments like jewelry crafted by time itself. The texture of the morning air seems to carry more information now, subtle variations in pressure and humidity that speak of weather systems influenced by the additional mass circling overhead, patterns of atmospheric circulation that may be shifting in response to gravitational effects too small to detect with conventional instruments but significant enough to alter the paths that storms follow as they move across continents shaped by forces that operate on timescales measured in geological epochs. Thomas watches the sun climb higher and notices that its reflection on the water creates bands of light that pulse with the same rhythm he has begun to detect in other phenomena around the village, a tempo that seems to synchronize with the orbital period of the innermost particles in the ring system, suggesting connections between the cosmic and the terrestrial that may have profound implications for understanding how worlds and their satellite systems evolve together over the vast stretches of time required for such subtle influences to accumulate into observable effects. The morning progresses with a sense of discovery that feels both exciting and peaceful, each small observation adding another piece to a puzzle that may be too large for any single mind to assemble completely, but which offers hints that the world has entered a new phase of its existence, a period when the familiar processes of weather and tide and seasonal change will unfold according to rules that incorporate the gentle but persistent influence of countless fragments of cosmic debris that circle the planet like a crown of ancient memory made visible in the morning sky. Sarah tends her garden with hands that have begun to sense vibrations in the soil that may reflect the way plant roots respond to electromagnetic fields altered by the presence of the ring system. And as she works, she finds herself wondering whether the changes she observes are truly the result of cosmic influences or simply the product of attention made more acute by living under a transformed sky that asks those who look up to consider possibilities that previous generations never needed to contemplate. And in the end, perhaps it does not matter which explanation proves correct, because the act of wondering, of paying closer attention to the subtle relationships between all things, may be the most important transformation of all. The days that follow bring a heightened awareness to both Sarah and Thomas, a quality of attention that makes ordinary moments feel charged with possibility. And in the pale light of early morning, Sarah begins to collect samples of the frost that forms in those strange spiraling patterns on metal surfaces throughout the village, storing the melted water in small glass jars that line her kitchen windowsill like captured fragments of a mystery that seems to grow more complex with each careful observation. The temperature on these collection mornings hovers always at the same precise point just below freezing, as if some invisible force regulates the conditions necessary for these peculiar crystal formations to appear. And when Sarah holds the jars up to the light that filters through the ring system, she notices that the water seems to carry a faint shimmer, particles too small to see clearly but present enough to create subtle variations in the way sunlight passes through the liquid. Thomas walks the harbor at dawn with a notebook that grows thicker each day, documenting the patterns of early tide arrivals that have shifted from 7 minutes to 12 minutes ahead of the predicted schedule, a progression so steady and gradual that it suggests the influence of forces operating with clockwork precision, though the source of such forces remains as elusive as the meaning of the strange warmth he continues to detect in the wooden planks of his dock. The sound of water moving against the pilings has developed new overtones, harmonic frequencies that seem to resonate with something beyond the immediate physics of liquid meeting solid. And when Thomas kneels to place his ear against the dock, he hears what might be a distant humming, so faint that he cannot be certain whether it originates in the water below or the air above, or perhaps in the vibration of the earth itself. In the growing collection of Edmund's notebooks that Sarah has borrowed from the library, she discovers references to similar phenomena recorded decades ago, but dismissed as anomalies, brief mentions of unusual frost formations and unexplained temperature variations that appeared sporadically throughout the naturalist's years of observation, scattered clues that might have meant nothing when they occurred in isolation, but which now seem to suggest a pattern that has been building slowly, invisibly, for far longer than anyone realized. The pale morning light reveals details in these old field notes that become visible only when examined under the particular quality of radiance that now characterizes dawn in Millbrook. Faded ink that seems to glow slightly when touched by sunbeams that have passed through the ring system, creating contrast between dark and bright that makes certain words stand out as if they were written with different materials entirely. Thomas notices that the fish he catches have begun to display subtle changes in their behavior, not dramatic alterations but small shifts in the way they move through the water, the depths they prefer, the times of day when they feed most actively, patterns that deviate just enough from his lifetime of experience to suggest that something in the marine environment has shifted in ways that affect the most fundamental rhythms of oceanic life. The water itself feels different against his hands when he reaches down to secure his nets, not warmer or cooler but somehow more substantial, as if it has learned to carry additional information in its molecular structure, memories of contact with particles that have drifted down from the cosmic architecture that circles overhead like a vast instrument playing music too subtle for human ears to detect directly. Sarah's garden responds to her touch with new sensitivity, soil that seems more receptive to the pressure of her fingers, plants that bend toward her hands, as if they can sense vibrations that travel through flesh and bone in frequencies that bypass conscious awareness and speak directly to the nervous systems of living things that have evolved to detect the faintest changes in their environment. The roots of her roses have begun to grow in patterns that spiral gently downward into the earth, following curves that mirror the frost formations she observes on metal surfaces, as if plant and mineral alike respond to influences that shape growth according to geometric principles that operate on scales ranging from the microscopic to the planetary. In the dim light of evening, when the rings begin their transformation into bands of luminous beauty, both Sarah and Thomas find themselves drawn to quiet observation, standing in places where they can watch the slow procession of shadows and light across familiar landscapes that seem less familiar with each passing day, terrain that holds secrets just beneath the surface of perception like messages written in a language that exists at the boundary between the known and the unknown. The old stones that line the village paths have developed a tendency to hold warmth longer after sunset, retaining heat in ways that create subtle temperature variations across surfaces that once cooled uniformly. And when Sarah walks these paths in the gathering darkness, she can trace the patterns of residual warmth with her fingertips, mapping invisible geographies of thermal energy that seem to follow lines of connection between the earthly and the celestial. Thomas discovers that his compass needle has begun to deviate slightly from true magnetic north, a wandering so gradual that he notices it only by comparing current readings with careful measurements recorded in previous months. But the drift follows a pattern that suggests the magnetic field around Millbrook may be responding to influences that operate beyond the familiar interactions between the Earth's core and the solar wind. The water in the harbor has developed new currents that flow in directions his experience cannot predict, subtle movements that create eddies and patterns on the surface that catch and hold the ring light in ways that make navigation by visual landmarks more complex, requiring adjustments to techniques that fishermen have used successfully for generations to find their way across waters that seemed as predictable as the movement of the tides themselves. Sarah's collection of frost samples has grown to fill 2 windowsills, jars arranged in chronological order that reveal a progression toward greater complexity in the crystal structures that form on cold mornings. Patterns that seem to be evolving according to some invisible logic that guides the arrangement of ice into configurations that become more intricate with each successive collection, as if the water itself is learning new ways to organize its molecules when temperatures drop below the threshold where liquid becomes solid. The notebook pages where Thomas records his observations have begun to curl at the edges despite being stored in a dry place. Paper that seems to respond to humidity changes that follow cycles different from the ones he learned to expect over decades of living by the sea, atmospheric rhythms that may reflect the way the ring system alters the distribution of moisture in air that has been touched by cosmic influences operating on timescales that dwarf human memory. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the village sleeps and only the most dedicated observers are awake to witness the subtle phenomena that appear at the boundary between night and day, Sarah and Thomas sometimes encounter each other on their separate errands of investigation, exchanging nods and quiet words that acknowledge their shared sense that something important is happening, something that requires patience and careful attention to reveal itself fully. The stars visible through the ring system seem brighter on some nights than others, variations in luminosity that may be caused by changes in the density of particles along different sections of the orbital path, creating a natural filter that adjusts the intensity of starlight according to patterns that could take years to map completely, assuming anyone possesses the dedication necessary to record such slow transformations in the appearance of the night sky. Sarah's roses have begun to bloom out of season, flowers that appear with perfect timing to coincide with the coldest mornings when the spiral frost formations reach their greatest complexity, as if plant and mineral respond to the same subtle influences that coordinate biological and geological processes according to rhythms that connect the growth of living things with the crystallization of water vapor into patterns that speak of connections between the organic and the inorganic realms. The wooden surfaces throughout the village continue to hold warmth in ways that create comfortable spots for sitting and resting during the cooler parts of the day, benches and fence posts and porch steps that seem to have learned to store and release thermal energy according to schedules that provide exactly the right amount of heat at exactly the moments when human comfort requires such gentle assistance from the built environment. Thomas finds that his fishing lines hang differently in the water, not quite straight down as they always have before, but with subtle curves that suggest the presence of currents or fields that operate below the threshold of direct observation, influences that affect the behavior of materials in ways that require new understanding of how objects move through spaces that may be less empty than they appear to casual inspection. The quality of silence between sounds has grown deeper and more textured. Pauses in conversation and gaps between footsteps that seem to hold more information than they once did. Acoustic spaces that carry overtones and harmonics that suggest the air itself has become more complex in its ability to transmit vibrations across the distances that separate one consciousness from another in a world that may be learning new methods of connection and communication. The morning when Sarah discovers that her frost samples have begun to sing arrives with the kind of clarity that makes every detail sharp and present. Air so still that the faintest vibrations become audible to those who have learned to listen with more than their ears. And as she approaches the windowsill where her collection of glass jars catches the early light, she hears something that might be music or might be the sound of molecules rearranging themselves according to patterns that follow. Rules more complex than simple chemistry. The tone emerges from the jars themselves, a harmonic frequency so subtle that she might have dismissed it as imagination if not for the way it synchronizes perfectly with the pulse she has been feeling in the spiral frost formations, creating a resonance that seems to connect the microscopic structure of ice crystals with something much larger, much more encompassing than the immediate physics of water changing state from liquid to solid. Thomas experiences his own moment of revelation when he discovers that the wooden planks of his dock have begun to display growth rings that were never there before, concentric circles that appear in the grain of timber that was cut from trees decades ago, patterns that emerge overnight like memories surfacing from the deep structures of cellulose and lignin that have somehow learned to record new information about the passage of time in a world where the very nature of temporal flow may be shifting in response to influences that operate beyond ordinary understanding. The warmth he has been detecting in these wooden surfaces now reveals itself as something more active than passive heat retention, a phenomenon that seems to involve the actual generation of thermal energy within the molecular structure of the wood itself, as if the cosmic particles settling from the ring system carry with them the ability to catalyze processes that transform ordinary materials into something approaching living tissue, matter that responds to environmental changes with the sensitivity usually associated with biological rather than inorganic systems. The sound that both Sarah and Thomas have been hearing in quiet moments grows stronger as winter deepens, a harmonic frequency that seems to emerge from the interaction between the electromagnetic fields generated by the ring system and the magnetic properties of iron compounds present in the soil beneath Millbrook, creating a natural resonance chamber that turns the entire village into a kind of instrument played by forces that operate on scales ranging from the subatomic to the planetary. Sarah's roses continue to bloom despite the cold, flowers that appear with timing so precise that she begins to suspect they respond not to temperature or daylight, but to some other signal entirely, perhaps to variations in the gravitational field created by the orbital dance of countless particles overhead. Tiny fluctuations that could influence the flow of nutrients through plant tissues in ways that coordinate blooming cycles with celestial mechanics rather than terrestrial seasons. The water collected from her frost samples has developed properties that become apparent only under specific lighting conditions. A luminescence that appears when the liquid is exposed to the particular quality of starlight that filters through the ring system, suggesting that the cosmic dust settling from orbit carries with it trace elements that react to certain wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation in ways that create optical effects previously unknown on Earth. Thomas notices that his fishing nets bring up catches that include species that should not exist in these waters, fish that display characteristics of both deep ocean and shallow coastal varieties, as if the changing conditions in the harbor have created new ecological niches that allow hybrid forms to survive and thrive in environments that were previously too specialized to support such genetic diversity. The tidal patterns he has been documenting reveal a complexity that goes beyond simple gravitational effects, water movements that seem to respond to multiple influencing factors operating simultaneously, creating interference patterns in the rise and fall of the sea that suggest the presence of resonance effects between the traditional lunar tides and whatever forces the ring system contributes to the complex dance of celestial bodies that determine when and how water moves around the margins of continents. The old notebooks borrowed from the library begin to display text that was not visible when Sarah first examined them, words that appear between the lines of Edmund's original observations as if written in ink that becomes legible only under specific conditions, revealing a secondary layer of documentation that describes phenomena remarkably similar to what she and Thomas are witnessing now, suggesting that these changes may represent the acceleration of processes that have been building slowly, for much longer than anyone realized. The frost formations on metal surfaces throughout the village have evolved beyond simple spirals into three-dimensional structures that seem to defy the usual physics of crystal growth. Ice that builds upward and outward in patterns that create natural sculptures resembling the branching networks found in blood vessels, river deltas, and the root systems of plants, organic geometries that appear in purely mineral contexts as if the boundary between living and non-living matter has become more permeable under the influence of the cosmic architecture that circles overhead. Thomas discovers that the water temperature in different parts of the harbor varies according to patterns that correlate with the position of the ring shadows as they move across the surface throughout the day, creating thermal gradients that shift in predictable cycles and seem to concentrate marine life in areas where the temperature differentials are most pronounced, establishing new feeding grounds that follow the cosmic clockwork of orbital mechanics rather than the traditional rhythms of seasonal change. The magnetic compass readings that have been drifting away from true north now reveal themselves as part of a larger pattern of variation that follows the same orbital period as the innermost particles in the ring system, magnetic field fluctuations that pulse with the precision of a cosmic heartbeat and seem to influence not only navigation instruments but also the migration patterns of birds that have begun to arrive in Millbrook weeks earlier than their traditional seasonal schedules would predict. Sarah's garden soil has developed the ability to store and release moisture according to cycles that do not correspond to rainfall or irrigation. Earth that seems to breathe with a rhythm that echoes the pulse she detects in the frost formations, creating optimal growing conditions for plants that appear to be adapting to environmental cues that operate independently of traditional weather patterns and seasonal variations. The wooden surfaces that hold warmth throughout the village now display temperatures that follow mathematical curves, rather than the random variations typically associated with thermal behavior, heat distribution that suggests the presence of underlying patterns connecting seemingly separate phenomena according to principles that may represent new laws of physics emerging from the interaction between terrestrial matter and cosmic influences that were never part of the original conditions under which life on Earth evolved. Thomas finds that his boat responds differently to the movement of water beneath its hull, floating with a stability that seems enhanced by forces he cannot identify, as if the gravitational effects of the ring system create subtle buoyancy assistance that makes navigation easier and more predictable despite the increasingly complex current patterns that challenge traditional seamanship skills developed over generations of experience with waters that followed simpler, more familiar rules. The quality of light that filters through the ring system continues to reveal hidden details in familiar objects, textures and patterns that become visible only under the specific illumination conditions created by the interaction between sunlight and the countless particles that orbit overhead, suggesting that the cosmic dust settling from the rings may be altering the optical properties of surfaces throughout the village in ways that enhance human perception and make ordinary objects appear more vivid, more detailed, more alive than they seemed under the unfiltered radiance that characterized the world before the rings came to crown the sky. Sarah's collection of observations has grown to fill multiple notebooks, documentation that reveals correlations between phenomena that seemed unrelated when considered separately but which now appear to be manifestations of a single underlying process that operates across multiple scales simultaneously, connecting the behavior of ice crystals with the migration of fish, the growth patterns of plants with the thermal properties of wood, the magnetic orientation of compass needles with the timing of tidal flows in patterns that suggest the presence of organizing principles that transcend the traditional boundaries between different scientific disciplines. The evening air carries sounds further and with greater clarity than ever before, voices and footsteps and the gentle movement of water, creating an acoustic environment that seems more transparent, more conducive to communication across the distances that separate individual consciousness, as if the atmosphere itself has become more efficient at transmitting information between minds that are learning to perceive connections previously hidden beneath the surface of everyday experience in a world that may be teaching itself new methods of coherence and integration through the gentle but persistent influence of cosmic forces that operate with patience measured in geological timescales yet manifest their effects in moments small enough for human hearts to witness and wonder at their meaning. While Sarah and Thomas document their discoveries in Millbrook, similar phenomena begin to emerge in places far enough away to suggest that the changes they observe are not isolated to their small coastal village but part of something much larger, much more encompassing than local weather patterns or regional geological shifts. And in the mountain town of Highfield, nearly 200 miles inland, a clockmaker named Margaret notices that the pendulums in her workshop have begun to swing with rhythms that deviate subtly from the precise timing that has governed their movement for decades. The stones that form the foundation of her shop hold warmth in the same mysterious way that Thomas observes in the wooden planks of his dock, granite blocks that seem to generate thermal energy from within their crystalline structure rather than simply absorbing and releasing heat from external sources, creating a comfortable working environment that requires no additional heating, even when winter winds howl down from the peaks that surround the valley where Highfield nestles like a collection of jewels scattered across a landscape carved by ancient glaciers. Margaret's clocks tick with new harmonics, metallic sounds that carry overtones suggesting the presence of resonance effects that connect the mechanical oscillations of springs and gears with something operating on a much grander scale. And when she places her ear against the wooden cases that house her most delicate timepieces, she hears what might be an echo of the same harmonic frequency that Sarah detects in her collection of frost samples, a musical note that seems to emerge from the interaction between crafted materials and cosmic influences that were never part of the original design specifications for instruments intended to measure earthly time. The water that flows through the mountain streams around Highfield has developed the same subtle luminescence that appears in Sarah's jars when exposed to starlight filtered through the ring system, a glow so faint that it becomes visible only to eyes that have learned to see in near darkness, suggesting that the cosmic particles settling from orbit carry their influence far beyond the coastal regions where tidal effects might be expected to manifest most obviously. Margaret walks along these streams in the early morning hours when the ring shadows move across the mountainsides like the hands of a vast clock marking time according to celestial rather than terrestrial schedules, and she notices that the water sounds different as it moves over stones worn smooth by centuries of patient erosion, musical tones that seem to harmonize with the new rhythms emerging from her workshop, creating natural symphonies that connect the flow of liquid over mineral surfaces with the oscillations of metal springs in wooden cases hundreds of yards away. The wind that moves through the mountain passes carries sounds with greater clarity than Margaret remembers from her childhood in these same valleys. Voices and footsteps and the distant ringing of church bells traveling across distances that should absorb and scatter such vibrations. But instead the air seems to have become more efficient at transmitting acoustic information, more willing to carry messages between human settlements separated by miles of rocky terrain that once presented significant barriers to communication between isolated communities. In her clockmaking work, Margaret discovers that the metal components of her timepieces respond to her touch with new sensitivity, springs and gears that seem to align themselves more readily with her adjustments. as if the cosmic influences affecting other materials throughout the region have enhanced the responsiveness of crafted objects to human intention and care, creating partnerships between maker and made that operate according to principles that transcend the simple mechanical. Relationships between force and motion that have governed such work for centuries. The stars visible from the mountain observatory near Highfield shine with intensity that varies according to patterns that seem to correlate with the orbital cycles of the ring system. Brightness fluctuations that suggest the cosmic architecture surrounding Earth may be creating interference effects that modulate the amount of stellar radiation reaching the surface of the planet. Natural filters that adjust the night sky according to schedules that could take years to map completely, but which already influence the behavior of nocturnal animals that have begun to hunt and migrate according to new lunar and stellar calendars. Margaret's apprentice, a young man named Peter who has been learning the clockmaker's trade for 3 years, notices that his ability to hear the subtle differences between properly and improperly adjusted timepieces has become more acute under the transformed sky, as if the presence of the rings has enhanced human auditory perception in ways that make possible more precise discrimination between closely related sounds, more accurate assessment of mechanical tolerances that require adjustments, measured in fractions of degrees or increments so small that they exist at the very limit of what human senses can detect without technological assistance. The stone walls of buildings throughout Highfield have begun to display patterns similar to the growth rings that Thomas observes in the wooden planks of his dock. Concentric circles that appear in granite and limestone surfaces that have remained unchanged for decades, mineral formations that seem to record information about temporal cycles operating on scales much larger than the daily and seasonal rhythms that normally influence the behavior of geological materials, creating natural archives that may preserve evidence of cosmic influences extending back to periods long before human observers were present to document such phenomena. Peter walks the mountain paths in the evening hours when the ring glow provides enough illumination to make travel possible without artificial light, and he discovers that his footsteps create echoes that linger longer than the acoustics of the terrain should allow, sound reflections that seem to bounce between invisible surfaces in the air above, suggesting that the atmosphere itself may have developed new properties that affect the way vibrations propagate through spaces that appear empty to casual observation but which may contain structures too subtle for direct detection. The water that Margaret uses to clean her clockwork mechanisms has developed the ability to remove tarnish and corrosion more effectively than the same liquid demonstrated before the rings appeared, chemical properties that seem enhanced by contact with cosmic particles too small to see but present in sufficient quantities to alter the molecular behavior of solutions that interact with metal surfaces according to principles that may represent new forms of chemistry emerging from the intersection of terrestrial matter with materials formed in the outer regions of the solar system. The rhythm of daily life in Highfield has begun to synchronize with the movement of ring shadows across the mountainsides, residents adjusting their schedules to take advantage of the thermal effects created when cosmic architecture blocks or concentrates solar radiation, according to patterns that provide natural heating and cooling at precisely the times when human comfort requires such environmental assistance, creating partnerships between settlement and sky that operate without conscious planning but which demonstrate remarkable efficiency in meeting basic needs for warmth and illumination. Margaret's workshop fills with light that changes quality throughout the day as the ring system rotates overhead, illumination that reveals details in her work that were previously invisible under direct sunlight, showing imperfections and alignments in clockwork mechanisms with clarity that allows more precise adjustments and repairs, enhancing the accuracy of timepieces that must measure intervals too small for human perception to assess without technological mediation between observation and understanding. The connection between the phenomena Margaret and Peter observe in Highfield and the changes that Sarah and Thomas document in Millbrook becomes apparent when Margaret decides to travel to the coast to examine the tidal patterns that might affect the precision required for marine chronometers, instruments that must account for the motion of ships on waters that may no longer follow the predictable cycles that navigators have relied upon for centuries of ocean travel. The stones along the mountain road that connects Highfield to the coastal regions display the same warmth that both communities have noticed in their local building materials, granite outcroppings that seem to store and release thermal energy according to schedules that coordinate with the orbital mechanics of the ring system, rather than the simple absorption and radiation cycles that normally govern how mineral surfaces interact with solar radiation throughout the course of daily and seasonal temperature variations. Margaret arrives in Millbrook on an evening when the ring glow creates optimal conditions for observing the phenomena that have captured the attention of Sarah and Thomas. And as the three compare their separate collections of observations and measurements, they begin to perceive patterns that connect clockwork precision with crystal formation, tidal rhythms with pendulum oscillations, the flow of mountain streams with the movement of coastal currents in relationships that suggest the presence of organizing principles that operate across geographical boundaries and link separated communities through shared participation in transformations that may be affecting the entire planet simultaneously. The wind that carries Margaret's voice, as she describes her discoveries to Sarah and Thomas, seems to enhance the clarity of communication between minds that have learned to perceive connections previously hidden beneath the surface of everyday experience. Air that has become more efficient at transmitting not just acoustic information, but perhaps more subtle forms of data that allow human consciousness to share insights and observations with precision that transcends the limitations normally imposed by the boundaries between individual awareness and collective understanding, creating possibilities for collaboration and coordination that may be essential for comprehending changes that operate on scales too large for any single perspective to encompass completely. The phenomena that Sarah, Thomas, Margaret, and Peter have documented across the distance between Millbrook and Highfield might be explained by forces as simple as electromagnetic fields created when billions of tiny particles orbit Earth in perfectly synchronized motion, each fragment of cosmic ice and stone carrying its own small electrical charge that could accumulate into effects powerful enough to influence everything from the crystallization of water vapor to the behavior of metal springs. In clockwork mechanisms scattered across continents shaped by millions of years of geological patience. Perhaps the cosmic dust settling from the ring system contains trace elements formed in the outer regions of the solar system, materials that carry within their atomic structure the memory of conditions that existed when the planets were young and the laws that govern chemical interactions were still learning to balance the forces that hold molecules together and pull them apart in the endless dance of attraction and repulsion that creates the substances from which worlds are built. The warmth that surfaces throughout both communities generate from within their own molecular structure could result from nuclear processes triggered by contact with particles that have traveled vast distances through space, carrying energy stored during their formation in stellar nurseries, where light and matter first learned to cooperate in the delicate choreography that transforms hydrogen into heavier elements through fusion reactions that release the power that makes stars shine across the darkness between galaxies. The harmonic frequencies that emerge from frost samples and clockwork mechanisms might be evidence of resonance effects that occur when terrestrial materials interact with gravitational waves created by the orbital motion of countless ring particles, vibrations in the fabric of space itself that propagate at the speed of light and could influence the behavior of matter on scales ranging from the subatomic to the planetary, creating connections between objects separated by distances that would normally prevent any form of direct interaction. The luminescence that appears in water exposed to starlight filtered through the ring system could be caused by quantum effects that occur when cosmic radiation interacts with molecules that have been altered by contact with extraterrestrial materials, chemical reactions that produce photons at wavelengths barely visible to human eyes but detectable by observers who have learned to see in conditions where ordinary illumination fails to reveal the subtle transformations taking place in substances that appear unchanged to casual inspection. The enhanced acoustic properties that both Margaret and Thomas observe in their respective environments might result from changes in atmospheric density caused by the gravitational effects of the ring system. Air that has become more efficient at transmitting sound waves because the additional mass orbiting overhead creates pressure variations that optimize the medium through which vibrations travel between sources and listeners separated by distances that once presented barriers to clear communication. The spiral patterns that appear in frost formations and the concentric circles that emerge in stone and wood surfaces could be manifestations of standing wave phenomena created when cosmic influences interact with terrestrial matter according to principles that govern how energy propagates through materials with different physical properties, creating interference patterns that reveal themselves in the arrangement of ice crystals and the grain structure of organic and inorganic substances that have learned to record information about forces operating beyond the immediate environment in which they exist. The changes in tidal timing that Thomas documents might be explained by resonance effects between the traditional gravitational pull of the moon and the additional forces created by the ring system, celestial mechanics that create complex interference patterns in the movement of water around coastlines that have been carved by millions of years of patient interaction between land and sea, establishing new rhythms that connect earthly phenomena with cosmic cycles operating on timescales that dwarf human memory but which manifest their effects in moments small enough for individual consciousness to witness and contemplate. The enhanced responsiveness that Margaret observes in her clockwork mechanisms could result from changes in the local magnetic field created by the orbital motion of charged particles in the ring system. Electromagnetic effects that influence the behavior of metal components in ways that make precision instruments more sensitive to adjustment and more stable in their operation, creating partnerships between human intention and material response that operate according to principles that transcend the simple mechanical relationships traditionally assumed to govern the interaction between maker and made. The ability of plants to bloom out of season and fish to adapt to new environmental conditions might be evidence of evolutionary processes accelerated by exposure to cosmic radiation that carries genetic information formed in stellar environments, where life learned to adapt to conditions far more extreme than those found on planetary surfaces. Biological influences that could enhance the rate at which living systems respond to environmental changes and develop new capabilities for survival in transformed ecosystems. The correlation between ring shadow movement and thermal effects across both mountain and coastal environments could be explained by solar radiation management on a planetary scale, where the ring system acts as a natural climate control mechanism that distributes heat according to patterns that optimize conditions for life, creating temperature gradients that follow celestial mechanics rather than terrestrial weather systems and establishing new relationships between cosmic architecture and biological comfort that operate without conscious design but which demonstrate remarkable efficiency in meeting the needs of organisms that have evolved to thrive under specific environmental conditions. The appearance of hybrid fish species in Thomas's nets might result from genetic mutations triggered by cosmic radiation filtering through the ring system, evolutionary pressures that accelerate the development of new biological forms capable of surviving in marine environments that have been altered by the presence of extraterrestrial materials settling into ocean waters that serve as the medium through which such influences propagate throughout the interconnected systems that support aquatic life on a planet that has learned to wear cosmic jewelry with biological grace. The three-dimensional frost structures that defy conventional crystal physics could be evidence of new states of matter that emerge when terrestrial substances interact with conditions that exist only in the presence of orbital debris fields, phase transitions that create solid forms with properties intermediate between traditional ice and more exotic materials that require extreme environmental conditions to maintain their structural integrity, natural sculptures that demonstrate the creative potential unleashed when familiar matter encounters influences that originate beyond the boundaries of planetary atmosphere. The mathematical precision with which various phenomena correlate across different geographical locations and material types suggests the presence of organizing principles that operate according to laws more fundamental than those traditionally used to describe the behavior of isolated systems, universal constants that govern the interaction between matter and energy on scales that connect the microscopic behavior of individual atoms with the macroscopic motion of celestial bodies in relationships that reveal the underlying unity of forces that appear separate when examined from limited perspectives, but which demonstrate their essential connection when observed with sufficient patience and attention to detail. The enhancement of human perception that both Peter and Sarah experience might be evidence of neurological changes triggered by exposure to electromagnetic fields created by the ring system, brain chemistry alterations that increase sensitivity to environmental stimuli and improve the ability to detect patterns and connections that normally operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, evolutionary adaptations that allow human consciousness to keep pace with environmental changes that require new forms of perception and understanding to navigate successfully. The question that emerges from contemplating these various possibilities is not which explanation proves correct, but whether the act of seeking such explanations changes the very nature of what is being observed, whether human attention itself becomes part of the phenomena under investigation, and whether the rings circling overhead might be teaching those who look up not just new ways of seeing the world, but new ways of being in relationship with mysteries that exist at the intersection of the known and the unknown, the familiar and the impossible, the earthly and the cosmic. asking each observer to consider whether the transformation they witness in their environment might be reflecting back to them the transformation taking place within their own capacity to perceive and appreciate the subtle connections that link all things in a universe where consciousness and matter dance together in patterns too beautiful and complex for any single mind to grasp completely, but perhaps accessible to hearts that have learned to wonder rather than merely to know. The evening air carries with it the weight of all the observations and measurements and careful notes that Sarah, Thomas, Margaret, and Peter have gathered through months of patient attention to phenomena that reveal themselves only to those who have learned to look without hurrying, to listen without demanding answers, to touch the world with the kind of gentle curiosity that treats each small discovery as a gift rather than a conquest. And as they walk the familiar paths between Millbrook and Highfield under skies that shimmer with the soft radiance of rings catching starlight, their footsteps create a rhythm that seems to harmonize with the deeper pulse they have all learned to detect in the heartbeat of a world that has become more mysterious rather than less so with each day of careful observation. The lamplight that spills from windows throughout both communities illuminates faces that have grown more peaceful during these months of living with questions that have no simple answers. People who have discovered that not knowing can be its own form of wisdom when approached with the patience that allows mystery to unfold at its own pace, rather than demanding that understanding arrive according to human schedules that measure time in minutes and hours instead of the geological epochs. Required for planets to learn new ways of dancing with the cosmic partners that have joined their orbital ballet. Sarah's hands move through her garden with the gentleness of someone who has learned that the earth responds better to care than to force. Fingers that can detect the subtle vibrations that travel through soil enriched by cosmic dust too fine to see, but present enough to transform the very chemistry of growth. And when she kneels among her roses that bloom in patterns that follow celestial rather than terrestrial calendars, she experiences the kind of contentment that comes from accepting the role of witness rather than director in the unfolding story of a world that has become more alive, more responsive, more willing to share its secrets with those who approach it with the humility that recognizes human understanding as just one small voice in a much larger conversation between matter and energy, consciousness and cosmos, the known and the eternally unknowable. Thomas's maps spread across his kitchen table tell the story of tides that have learned new rhythms, currents that follow paths his grandfather never had to navigate, fishing grounds that shift according to underwater topographies that may be responding to gravitational influences too subtle for instruments to measure directly but persistent enough to reshape the ocean floor in patterns that will take decades to fully reveal themselves. And as he traces these changes with pencil lines that grow more confident with each passing week, he finds himself grateful for the opportunity to be part of documenting transformations that connect his small harbor with forces that operate on scales vast enough to humble any human attempt to claim mastery over the natural world. The still water that fills Margaret's workshop basin reflects the ring glow that filters through her windows, creating a surface so calm that it seems to hold not just light but time itself. Moments suspended in liquid that has learned to carry more information than simple chemistry would suggest possible. And when she dips her tools into this transformed water to clean the delicate mechanisms that measure earthly time according to cosmic influences that were never part of the original design, specifications for chronometers built to serve purely terrestrial purposes, she experiences the satisfaction that comes from work that serves something larger than immediate necessity, labor that connects human craftsmanship with universal principles that operate according to laws beautiful enough to inspire reverence rather than mere technical admiration. Peter's young hands have learned to feel vibrations in metal, and what that older craftsman might dismiss as imagination, sensitivity that allows him to detect the subtle harmonics that emerge when human intention aligns with material properties enhanced by cosmic influences that transform ordinary substances into partners in the patient work of measuring time according to rhythms that connect the ticking of clockwork mechanisms with the orbital dance of particles that circle overhead like prayers made visible in the architecture of ice and stone and captured starlight. The memory of how the world felt before the rings arrived grows dimmer with each passing season, not because forgetting comes easily, but because the present moment offers such richness of experience that nostalgia for simpler times feels less compelling than gratitude for the opportunity to witness changes that most generations never have the privilege of observing. Transformations that reveal the Earth as more dynamic, more creative, more capable of surprise than any textbook description of. Planetary behavior could capture in words designed to contain mysteries that resist containment and flourish most fully when approached with the kind of open attention that expects wonder rather than demanding explanation. The care that all four observers bring to their daily work takes on new meaning when every small task becomes an opportunity to participate in the larger story of a world learning to accommodate cosmic influences that ask for patience rather than panic, adaptation rather than resistance, curiosity rather than fear of change that challenges assumptions about the stability of natural laws that may be more flexible, more responsive to new conditions than human science has yet learned to appreciate fully. Time moves differently now in both Millbrook and Highfield, not faster or slower, but with greater depth. Moments that seem to contain more possibility, hours that feel more spacious, days that unfold according to rhythms that synchronize human activity with celestial mechanics in ways that create harmony between the needs of daily life and the grander choreography of planetary motion around a sun that shares its radiance with countless worlds, each learning its own unique dance with the forces that govern the behavior of matter in the vast theater of space where stars are born and galaxies spiral through darkness, punctuated by islands of light that connect across distances too great for human imagination to traverse but small enough for human hearts to sense their kinship with all things that move in patterns too beautiful to be accidental. The wonder that fills quiet moments throughout both communities becomes its own form of nourishment, feeding a kind of spiritual hunger that many people never realize they carry until circumstances create opportunities for their souls to feast on mystery approached with reverence rather than analysis, beauty encountered without the need to possess or explain or reduce to manageable categories that fit within frameworks designed to organize experience according to human limitations rather than cosmic possibilities that operate according to principles vast enough to include all contradictions, patient enough to unfold over timescales that dwarf individual lifetimes but intimate enough to manifest in moments as small as the formation of a single ice crystal or the adjustment of a single gear in a clockwork mechanism that keeps time for hearts that have learned to beat in rhythm with something much larger than their own immediate concerns. The night air that moves between the two communities carries with it the scent of changes too subtle for names, atmospheric chemistry altered by the presence of cosmic dust that settles like the finest blessing onto surfaces that have learned to receive such gifts with gratitude rather than suspicion. And when Sarah and Thomas and Margaret and Peter step outside to observe the ring glow that transforms familiar landscapes into something that feels both ancient and newly born, they experience the kind of peace that comes from recognizing their place in a story larger than any individual chapter, more complex than any single perspective could encompass, more beautiful than any human description could capture completely. The soft hands that tend gardens and adjust mechanisms and record observations and clean tools move with the confidence that comes from work aligned with forces that operate according to principles deeper than mere technique, more enduring than temporary fashion, more generous than human ambition. And in the gentle precision with which daily tasks are performed lies evidence of the transformation that occurs when people learn to approach their world with the respect that recognizes every material surface as potentially sacred, every moment of contact between human intention and terrestrial matter as an opportunity for communion rather than conquest, every observation as a prayer of attention offered to mysteries that respond to reverence with revelation graduated according to the readiness of hearts that have learned to receive more than they demand, to wonder more than they worry, to trust the unfolding of processes too vast for complete comprehension but intimate enough to touch individual lives with the kind of meaning that transforms ordinary days into opportunities for participation in the cosmic story that includes all things in patterns of relationship that connect the smallest details of daily life with the grandest movements of celestial bodies through space and time that holds all possibilities in embrace gentle enough to nurture growth, patient enough to allow transformation to proceed at its own pace, generous enough to include every form of consciousness in the ongoing conversation between matter and spirit that creates the conditions within which wonder becomes not just possible but inevitable for those who have learned to live with questions that have no final answers but infinite depth, infinite beauty, infinite capacity to transform those who approach them with the kind of open attention that discovers in not knowing a form of knowledge more satisfying than any certainty could provide. The story of Sarah and Thomas and Margaret and Peter unfolds like the slow turning of seasons in a world that has learned to wear cosmic jewelry with grace, their careful observations and patient documentation creating a tapestry of understanding that connects the frost formations spiraling on garden gates with the harmonic frequencies emerging from clockwork mechanisms, the luminescent water collected in glass jars, with the warmth that generates itself in wooden surfaces and granite stones, the changed behavior of fish and birds with the enhanced sensitivity of human perception that allows consciousness to detect patterns previously hidden beneath the surface of everyday experience in communities that have become laboratories for the gentle transformation of everything familiar into something more mysterious, more alive, more willing to share secrets with those who approach the world with reverence rather than demand. The ring system continues its silent dance overhead, countless particles of ice and stone following orbital paths that create shadows and light patterns across landscapes where people have learned to read time according to celestial mechanics rather than mechanical clocks, where tides arrive according to schedules that blend lunar gravity with whatever additional forces the cosmic architecture contributes to the ancient rhythm of water rising and falling around coastlines carved by millions of years of patient negotiation between land and sea. The observations recorded in notebooks that grow thicker with each passing week tell the story of a planet learning to accommodate influences that operate according to principles more subtle than traditional physics has yet learned to describe, changes that manifest in phenomena small enough for individual attention to witness, but connected to processes vast enough to humble any human attempt to claim complete understanding of the forces that govern the behavior of worlds and their orbital companions in the cosmic dance that connects all matter across distances measured in light years, but experienced in moments as intimate as the touch of frost against fingertips that have learned to feel vibrations too subtle for ordinary awareness to detect. The warmth that surfaces generate from within their own molecular structure continues to provide comfort during cold mornings, when ring shadows create patterns of thermal variation that follow celestial schedules rather than terrestrial weather systems. Natural heating that operates without conscious design but with efficiency that suggests the presence of organizing principles that coordinate cosmic influences with biological needs in relationships that transcend the simple mechanical interactions traditionally assumed to govern the behavior of matter in environments where life has learned to thrive under conditions that include both earthly and extraterrestrial components in the complex chemistry of existence. The harmonic frequencies that emerge from frost samples and clockwork mechanisms and the movement of water over stone surfaces create a natural symphony that connects the microscopic behavior of ice crystals with the macroscopic motion of celestial bodies. Music that suggests the universe operates according to principles more beautiful than any human composition could capture, but which becomes audible to those who have learned to listen with more than their ears, to hear in the vibrations of matter, the echo of forces that create harmony between the cosmic and the terrestrial through processes that require patience measured in geological timescales, but which manifest their effects in moments small enough for human hearts to witness and appreciate. The luminescence that appears in water exposed to starlight filtered through the ring system continues to provide gentle illumination that reveals details previously hidden in darkness. Natural phosphorescence that demonstrates the capacity of terrestrial matter to respond to cosmic influences in ways that enhance, rather than diminish, the conditions necessary for life to flourish under skies that have become more complex, more layered with meaning, more generous in their distribution of the subtle energies that connect all things in patterns of relationship that operate below the threshold of casual observation but which reward careful attention with revelations that transform understanding without requiring the abandonment of wonder. The three-dimensional frost structures that appear on metal surfaces throughout both Millbrook and Highfield continue to evolve into forms that defy conventional crystal physics. Ice sculptures that seem to grow according to geometric principles that connect the arrangement of water molecules with the orbital patterns of ring particles. Natural art that demonstrates the creative potential unleashed when familiar matter encounters influences that originate beyond the boundaries of planetary atmosphere and which carry within their atomic structure the memory of conditions that existed in stellar nurseries where the elements from which worlds are built first learned to dance together in the nuclear furnaces that create the diversity of materials from which consciousness eventually emerges to contemplate its own cosmic origins. The enhanced responsiveness that Margaret observes in her clockwork mechanisms allows her timepieces to achieve precision that approaches the accuracy of atomic clocks. Mechanical instruments that seem to synchronize themselves with cosmic rhythms that operate according to universal constants more fundamental than the local gravitational effects traditionally used to calibrate such devices, creating partnerships between human craftsmanship and celestial mechanics that produce measurements of temporal flow that account for influences operating on scales ranging from the subatomic to the galactic in relationships that reveal time itself as more flexible, more responsive to cosmic conditions than classical physics has yet learned to appreciate fully. The correlation between phenomena observed across geographical distances suggests that the changes affecting both communities represent manifestations of planetary scale processes that operate according to organizing principles capable of coordinating transformations across continental boundaries, creating coherence between separated locations that demonstrates the capacity of cosmic influences to generate effects that transcend the limitations normally imposed by distance and isolation, connecting all terrestrial matter in networks of relationship that operate through mechanisms too subtle for current scientific instruments to detect directly but persistent enough to produce observable results that accumulate over time into evidence of forces that govern the behavior of worlds learning to accommodate new cosmic partners in their orbital environment. The question of how long these phenomena will continue to manifest remains as open as the wider sky that arches over both communities, suggesting that the ring system may represent not a temporary disruption of natural laws, but a permanent addition to the forces that govern planetary behavior, cosmic architecture that will continue to influence everything from the crystallization of water vapor to the migration patterns of birds for as long as the orbital mechanics that hold the particles in their circular dance remains stable according to gravitational principles that operate with patience measured in billions of years, but which create effects intimate enough to touch individual lives with transformations that enhance rather than threaten the conditions necessary for consciousness to flourish under cosmic influences that ask for adaptation rather than resistance. The memory of how the world felt before the rings arrived fades like candlelight dimming at the end of a long evening, not because forgetting comes easily, but because the present moment offers such richness of experience that nostalgia for simpler times feels less compelling than gratitude for the opportunity to live during a period when the Earth itself demonstrates its capacity for creative response to cosmic influences that reveal the universe as more dynamic, more interconnected, more willing to surprise those who approach it with reverence than any static description of natural laws could suggest, creating conditions within which wonder becomes not just possible, but inevitable for hearts that have learned to recognize mystery as invitation rather than obstacle to understanding that grows deeper through patient attention rather than hasty analysis. The tide of change that has transformed both Millbrook and Highfield continues to flow according to rhythms that connect earthly cycles with cosmic mechanics. Water that rises and falls in patterns that include both lunar gravity and whatever additional forces the ring system contributes to the ancient conversation between celestial bodies and terrestrial matter, creating new relationships between the movement of oceans and the dance of orbital debris that demonstrates the capacity of natural systems to achieve balance between stability and transformation, continuity and innovation, familiar rhythms and cosmic surprises that require consciousness to expand its capacity for appreciation, rather than demanding that the universe conform to expectations based on limited experience of how worlds behave when they wear only their original complement of cosmic jewelry. The wide sky that stretches over both communities holds within its ring-crowned expanse all the mysteries that Sarah and Thomas and Margaret and Peter have documented without solving. Questions that remain as open and inviting as the space between stars where new worlds continue to form according to principles that connect the birth of planets with the consciousness that eventually emerges to contemplate the cosmic processes that create the conditions within which life learns to flourish under. Influences that span the distance between the microscopic and the galactic, creating unity between the smallest details of frost formation and the largest movements of celestial architecture through relationships that operate according to laws beautiful enough to inspire reverence in hearts that have learned to breathe in rhythm with the gentle pulse that connects all things in patterns of meaning too vast for complete comprehension but intimate enough to touch individual souls with the peace that comes from recognizing participation in stories larger than any single chapter, more enduring than any individual lifetime, more generous than any human imagination could encompass. Stories that continue to unfold under skies wide enough to hold all possibilities, patient enough to allow wonder to mature at its own pace, gentle enough to cradle consciousness in the eternal present where mystery and meaning dance together in the space between one breath and the next, one heartbeat and the following silence, one moment of attention and the infinite sky that holds all moments in embrace warm enough to nurture growth, vast enough to contain all questions, beautiful enough to transform wondering into worship of the cosmic creativity that writes itself across the heavens in scripts of ice and starlight that spell out messages of connection between Earth and cosmos, matter and consciousness, time and eternity in a language that speaks directly to hearts that have learned to read the subtle signatures that cosmic forces leave in the arrangement of frost crystals and the timing of tides and the harmony of clockwork mechanisms that measure earthly time according to celestial rhythms that connect all temporal flow with the eternal dance of matter and energy through space that holds all worlds in orbital embrace gentle enough to allow planets to learn new steps in the cosmic choreography without losing the essential stability that allows life to flourish under conditions that blend the familiar with the impossible, the earthly with the cosmic, the known with the eternally mysterious in relationships that create the conditions within which consciousness can expand its capacity for wonder without losing its grounding in the immediate textures of daily life where frost forms on garden gates and tides arrive at harbors and clocks tick in workshops where human hands work in partnership with cosmic influences to create beauty from the patient marriage of attention and mystery that transforms ordinary moments into opportunities for communion with forces vast enough to humble any pretension to complete understanding but intimate enough to touch individual hearts with the peace that passes understanding and settles into souls like starlight filtered through rings of ancient ice that circle overhead in eternal reminder that the universe operates according to principles more beautiful than human language can capture but which reveal themselves to consciousness that has learned to rest in wonder rather than rushing toward answers that dissolve like morning mist when approached with anything less than the reverence that recognizes mystery as the natural state of awareness open enough to receive the gifts that cosmos offers to hearts willing to breathe in rhythm with the gentle pulse that connects all things under skies wide enough to hold every question in embrace warm as candlelight, patient as tide, eternal as the stars that shine through rings of cosmic jewelry that crown the earth with beauty beyond description but not beyond appreciation for those who have learned to see with eyes that expect wonder and find it everywhere they look with sufficient patience and care and love for the world that has become home to consciousness capable of recognizing itself as part of the cosmic story that includes all things in patterns of relationship that operate according to laws written in starlight across the vast pages of space where new chapters continue to unfold under skies that stretch beyond the horizon of human imagination but not beyond the reach of human hearts that have learned to beat in time with the rhythm that connects all things in the eternal dance of matter and consciousness under the wide sky that holds all possibilities in gentle embrace.